So welcome to the third episode of Laundered, a podcast by Rely Comply, all the way from London this time around. It's really great to be out here, to be in the UK. Honored to have Gareth Doty with us today. He is the head of bribery and corruption investigation at City of London Police. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah.
We said last night there should probably be an anti-bribery and corruption somewhere in there, but I think it works. But really, thanks again for joining us, Gareth. I really look forward to having this chat today. It's going to be super interesting. So, you've been with the police service for 20 years?
Just under, 19 years, yeah.
Sure, long time. And obviously in many different roles, but all kind of at the intersection or in some way, shape or form, fraud-related, fraud, money laundering. Is that correct? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so I work for the City of London Police, and we're the lead force for fraud and cyber in the UK. So all of my career has really been sort of going in and out of sort of fraud, money laundering and other elements. I have specialised in other areas. So I spent a number of years working in major investigations, including murder investigations. I was involved in the Fishmongers Hall terrorism incident, which was not far from here, supporting the officers that were involved in that. Also public protection, which was much more around sort of vulnerability. But for a vast proportion of my time, I've been doing fraud investigations, money laundering, sort of national to international in fraud operations, which is my last role. And then now building a new team around bribery and corruption, which is all around looking at the enablers and facilitators of economic crime in the UK.
Okay, and a very broad-based question, but 20 years, 19 years, very long time. How have you seen financial crime evolve broadly over that period of time?
I think there has been a lot of evolution. I think the big things are technology changes, changes in sophistication, more of an organised international element to financial crime. I think technology is one of those things that in our sectors and in sort of banking and regulated sectors, talking about AI and machine learning is a huge part of what people are interested in, and rightly so. I think technology is being used on both sides. So, we think about the sorts of scams that we used to get into our inboxes not so long ago, which were, badly spelt and terrible grammar and,
Prince of so-and-so has got £10 million for you.
Exactly so, and everything was horribly spelt and it was just, it's just people didn't even look at them. Some people did, but many people didn't. But now you think of, ChatGPT and the equivalents, those easy signs of scams, they don't really exist anymore. They're well put together, much harder to detect. And when you're talking about scams and fraud at huge levels, millions upon millions of sort of spam messages going out every single day, it only takes 1% more people to click that button, click that link, and you've got a huge amount of money. You've got a huge number of people being defrauded. So I think technology is a real thing, a real change, and also something that, on our side of the fence, we have to get to grips with as well. So how are we going to tackle these changes in technology that scammers are using, money launderers are using to better detect, better screen out, sort of false positives, kind of get through the kind of the admin and the sort of the time-consuming work to get to the real nuts and bolts of investigations, I think is a challenge. And I think the other thing is sophistication. So I think going back years, certainly decades, people would commit fraud. They would take as much money as they possibly could from someone, and that was what they did. The money laundering, maybe there was a level of sophistication, maybe they needed to move the money internationally, but I think now it's much more regular, much more routine. So criminals are looking for multiple ways of exploiting victims. They're not just committing fraud against them and taking their money. They're then saying, well, what else can we do to exploit this person? Can we turn them into a money mule? Can we get them to create bank accounts or crypto accounts so we can use those to move money in a money laundering network? So I think that sophistication is something that's a real hallmark of change over that period.
Sounds like there's a lot of maturity. Like you said, it's become more organized. It must like 10 or 15 years ago, they were almost like startups, and now they're like fast scaling businesses, to put in a bit of lack of term. But really, I don't know if you saw the one email scam that came out now from where the guys are doing Microsoft.com, but it's an R and an N, so that it looks like an M. That's how and you if you read an email address, you'd know no difference.
No.
They're getting really sophisticated and highly organized. And I don't know, James, where that leads to, but I'm assuming there's what is all this organized kind of financial crime leading to? What is the purposes? What are these criminals using it for? And maybe that's why it's also matured or become more sophisticated.
It's just money. For most people, it's money. I think criminals are involved in a culture of criminality where they don't know any other way of being, and they socialize with other criminals, and there's bragging rights, and and you get sort of outliers like the sort of Bernie Madoff type things, like an extremely rich person still committing crime. He had no purpose, no need to. But clearly it's part of their psychology or part of their way of being that kind of drives them. But I think that's fundamentally it. It's looking for exploiting the system, getting money from others, using technology in an easy way to make their lives, more simple when it comes to scamming people. I think nowadays we probably have sort of other factors as well. So, we've talked about the funding of terrorism for a very long time and financial crime. But I think sponsorship by hostile states is really significant. We saw there was a prosecution in the US, I think it came out maybe a couple of months back, where a US national was facilitating illegal employment of North Korean sort of state-backed people. So they're doing remote IT type work. And her flat was sort of full of laptops that were all then, remotely accessed by North Korean nominals, and then passing the money across to North Korea. So obviously propping up the state financially. But just as she had no links necessarily to North Korea. It was almost like an employment opportunity. So there are other factors involved, but money, getting access to it, moving it internationally. If you're based in, Europe or wherever else, and you're targeting the UK for fraud, you need to move that money out. So you're talking about relatively sophisticated networks to move the value where you want it to be.
It's an interesting point you made there about, how technology is changing crime, but especially about the changes in what we would call a 419 scam, which is your email from your prince. Because sort of pre-AI time, a lot of that terrible spelling wasn't, in my understanding, entirely accidental, because it's very cheap to send out 1 million emails. But the second level, when someone actually engages with you, starts to take time and cost, human effort. So the emails were intentionally so bad, so you would only get the most gullible possible people because you were incurring real expenses for the second and third leg of the scam. But now that so much more of that can be automated, in fact, there doesn't have to be almost any human engagement. Someone can see the email, click a link, maybe it's a ransomware or something like that.
It can be sent out. It's like LLM.
Exactly, but because there isn't that second level of human engagement that you need, it's much better to be more convincing. So even in things like that, there's a complete inversion of the typology, which is really, really interesting. Just to see that relationship between changes in technology and changes in the nature of crime.
Yeah, I think so. And I think probably we're going to see more exploitation of technologies that are available. The sorts of scams that both companies and individuals get are invoice frauds, or the CEO type frauds and their equivalent. And it's much easier nowadays to get information about the internal structure of a company. And if you can find, if you just look on LinkedIn and Facebook and open source and news outlets, and you get a bit of an idea of, say, how a bank is structured or how a tech firm is structured. And then it becomes easy then to have an email from a CEO or someone else, like, you know, chief finance officer to someone requesting to move money. The data's there. And we know that there's technology that can automatically scrape the internet for this data. We know there's automation. We know there's either machine learning functions that can produce emails and things convincingly. When you tie those together, you've got a ready-made automated machine for sort of churning these things out. And that's the sort of thing that can target companies, it can target local government, it can target police forces, it can target private individuals. And it becomes much more difficult to spot because it's got that level of due diligence around it, if you like. But it's just done by a machine. That the human element, apart from setting it up and preparing it and pressing go, it doesn't need to be there.
Yeah. Geez, there's a lot. There's so many ways you can go. I mean, we were talking, I think last night, something came up around, you brought up quite a few stats. What is the growth of financial crime been? I mean, has it been growing like year on year, and to what extent?
Yeah, I think
And you can mix it as fraud money.
Yeah, so fraud in the UK, we're talking about, people say over 40% of all recorded crime is fraud. You know, the exact statistics going to vary year on year, but you're talking about, well nigh 50% of all crime. But what that doesn't take into consideration is all of those crime reports, all of those fraud reports, or frauds that aren't reported. Yeah. And we know this is a huge issue. We know a lot of companies will take a strategic decision not to report because it has an impact on, reputation. Also, private individuals, if people are investing, for example, and they lose the money, some people will just write it off as an expense. If they're going for relatively high risk investments and a couple end up being a scam, never mind. And others, there's definitely sort of psychological barriers as well. There's embarrassment and shame and having to have that conversation with family, particularly if you're talking about the loss of, really significant proportions of people's life savings or, sort of pension payouts and things like this. Very difficult conversations. We know that a lot of these people just don't report. So those numbers are definitely higher. And I think the trend has generally been for a number of years. And of course, whenever you've got a fraud, whenever you've got a scam, that money's going to get laundered. It has to be laundered. As soon as it needs to get moved and hidden, that's money laundering. And sort of going back to what we're talking about, that sort of international and organised element, that means that laundering is more sophisticated and sometimes more protracted. It's moving through more institutions, or it might be being changed from fiat to crypto to physical assets and back again. So it's sort of touching on, more points. So the more volume of scams, the more money laundering you're going to get. Obviously, currently I'm working in bribery and corruption, particularly looking at economic crime. And it's the values there are even more hidden. Because there's no one involved in a bribe that wants to talk to the police. Yeah. We deal with whistleblowers, but actually it's very, very hidden. And what often happens with that area of economic crime is it's facilitating sometimes legitimate business, non-legitimately, or sometimes illegitimate business. So greasing the gears of organised crime and, getting insurance cover within an insurance firm, or credit from a bank, or whatever else it happens to be. So that's an even shadier figure. But I think it's pretty clear that it is a problem, and it's something that has got very large numbers attached to it. We just don't have a clear understanding of what that is.
James?
Yeah, just to bring a bit of South African context to this, something that's very relevant in the news cycle right now is essentially a massive bribery and corruption network that is uncovered at one of our major hospitals, which so far looks something like 2 billion rand, which would be
£100 million.
£100 million extracted in, effectively taking advantage of the procurement network there, setting up shell company on shell company, often massive sort of syndicates, overcharging, sort of £100 for a plastic bucket or something like that. And the numbers are just staggering. What was also extremely sad is the chief accounting officer discovered this, reported it to her CFO, and that got leaked, and she got assassinated outside her house about 2 years ago. So I guess my question is sort of in terms of protections for whistleblowers in the UK, because we have a big problem with this in South Africa. What are the protections there, and what would your advice be to people that do uncover sort of syndicate activity?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important because fundamentally, often we are talking about organised crime, and organised crime groups will quite often be working across crime types. So, we think in financial crime terms as it being quite white collar, but actually you could be talking about, drug importation, we could talk about human trafficking, we could talk about all sorts of things. And wherever there's sort of that sort of organised crime networks and substantial money involved, there's often violence as well. So we do have to think about these things. In the UK, whistleblowing has got protections. There are rules and regulations in place about how a whistleblower needs to be looked after, how they should be dealt with by organisations, and you can find this stuff online. But there's sort of a definition of who counts as a whistleblower, and the different factors that then come into play around how they're treated and communications and so forth. But I think one of the things that's important to say is my view, and this is not the view necessarily of the City of London Police, but very often a whistleblower is created due to a failure of communication within an organisation. So in the example that you gave, had that been an effectively functioning organisation, that report would have turned into internal investigation, people would have been suspended, there would have been some internal action, and maybe a referral to law enforcement. But clearly there's a barrier there. And it's those barriers, it's organisations not listening or not having the mechanisms in place to have that self-scrutiny and improvement and cultural problems where things can't be resolved over the table that then causes people to blow the whistles. The first really important thing is organisations have to have clear processes. They have to have a level of transparency. They have to have a culture that embraces improvement and change and development, that tries to close the gaps that the criminals can exploit in these ways. So I think that's really important. As law enforcement, when we get involved with whistleblowers, we have a well-established sort of raft of legislation involved around looking after witnesses, protecting sources of intelligence. So, a really fundamental role of what law enforcement does, whether it be police or the NCA or whoever else, is looking after informants, protecting the sources of intelligence, looking after witnesses, if need be, finding alternative sources of evidence. We'd have to bring certain people into the courtroom. Obviously, if a whistleblower is willing and they want to produce an evidential statement, then that's superb for us, because that's the best way that we can take action against, criminals and organised crime networks.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's still intimidating. Well, it's still scary for whistleblowers.
I think so. Yeah, I think there are, large sort of psychological barriers, and I'm sure a lot of people don't fear. Absolutely. And from the work we're doing the last 2 years, we've seen that toxic work cultures kind of goes hand in hand with like bribery and corruption, internal fraud, internal threats. We see people that are using threats, intimidation, abuse, blackmail, any tool that they have in order to keep control of, their team or their staff. We see people getting, non-disclosure orders and getting sacked, threats that they'll never work in the industry again. And some of these people have a level of influence that they can actually stop people from work, or if not, then they have enough influence over the person that they fear it. So these are really big sort of big barriers for people. Many people have children, they have families, they have mortgages. You have to think about these sort of practical things. So it's always better to have sort of transparent gateways for communication and improvement in place and not have to take that step.
Can I take a step back quickly? You're talking about the UK and the level and growth of financial crime. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the UK is a mature market. It's highly regulated. I'm talking coming from South Africa, a fairly well-resourced police department function to fight this. Yet, it sounds, and I think you mentioned stats earlier, or last evening, around like just the level of activity, financial crime that goes on, kind of using the UK as a hub. And I actually thought about it. I was like, it feels like all of those regulations, all of this should be a barrier. I mean, there must be countries that are much easier to kind of launder money through or do financial crime. So why is the UK such a target? And do you think some of these things are failure?
It's a really interesting question. I think the level of maturity as a financial sector in the UK and in other linked jurisdictions as well, I think is one of those draws for people. There's a vast number of companies, a vast number of financial instruments, a vast number of routes of movement of money through the City of London, Canary Wharf, other jurisdictions. So I think that's one of those big draws. It's, it is a sort of a kind of a gateway to a lot of services. Obviously, things like faster payments, things like fraud and money laundering are really useful because, you click your fingers and the money's gone. Which, if you want to do things quickly and get the money out the way and somewhere safe, that's a real draw. So, I mean, I think those two things are big factors. In terms of regulation and law enforcement, I wouldn't want to use a language like success and failure, but it's kind of a war of attrition. We're talking about technology and, that's kind of an arms race. And I think that's probably the same for a broader financial crime fight as well. Wherever we close a gap, then, the criminals have been finding other ways to exploit it. And certainly when you're talking about technology is, closing doors and making monitoring, more effective, criminals are often then turning towards social engineering, manipulation of individuals, and quite often the sort of the weak link in the chain is going to be an individual, whether it be someone that's in financial hardship or someone that's got associations with organised crime or whatever else it happens to be. You're always going to have a changing playing field, changing typologies. Criminals will be looking for different ways of exploiting the system. And when we come up with new ways of doing things, new technologies, they're going to be looking for workarounds, either ways of exploiting it or avoiding it completely. So I think it's something that, fraud's probably one of the earliest, crimes ever. And it's not going to go away. It's just going to change. The nature of it's going to change. And our response is naturally going to have to change as well. So I wouldn't say it's around failure. I would say it's about evolution and sort of continuing to adapt and shift to the changing threat.
I mean, we've spoken a lot about technology. I mean, obviously, you're a technology person, but there is a huge human element to this. I mean, you're talking about vulnerable people and so on. I mean, you can't really stop that using technology, I guess. I mean, unless there's some opposing views. And I don't know. But then there's also a whole education factor. But that's also difficult, right? You said people are not.
I think the two things absolutely have to go hand in hand. And I think that kind of the skills and knowledge base for financial crime practitioners has evolved as well. As a sort of a fraud financial crime leader, I also have to be a technologist to an extent. I have to be thinking about the way I'm going to be identifying and using new technologies, the way I'm going to think about, I have to be thinking about automation, about efficiency, about machine learning, ways of making my team's lives more straightforward so that their skills and knowledge and experience can be applied in the right place. I don't want them to be doing hours of administration. I want them to be focusing directly on those insights and evidence that are going to come to, turn into prosecutions. And likewise in the financial sector, false positives are a problem. You've got people doing those investigations. You want to be screening out as much of that legwork as possible so that your experts are thinking, is this suspicious? What concerns me? And then reporting that up and getting those reports into the organisation, their customers, and also get that data to law enforcement so that we can take action. So they absolutely go hand in hand. And I think the kind of the picture of the skill set now of a financial crime practitioner is a real blend of insight, investigation, professional curiosity, and understanding how the systems work. How can you better adapt and change and develop your technology and systems in order to get the best bang for your buck?
I mean, has the kind of police services gone so far as to I'll say this, it's a bit of a strange question. You used to have white hat hackers or ex-financial crime criminals that kind of turned good, actually sit and think up new topologies and do those sorts of things. So you're talking about the skill set of financial practitioners. It's a bit interesting how you're going, I have to be a technologist. And it popped into my head. I was like, I wonder if, you had an money launderer, an example, and their whole job was just to work with law enforcement to basically think up how people could be exploiting new technologies. Or is that just something totally out there?
I mean, I don't work with any, but there are definitely ex-scammers who work with law enforcement as consultants, and there's a number of people that sort of go to conferences and talk about how to improve sort of target hardening and strengthen yourself against social engineering and things. But we need these insights because our role is. It's investigation, it's financial crime, it's risk, it's not necessarily kind of creative criminal typology. So,
yeah, yes. And are you allowed to share some really interesting cases? One or two that you...
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we were talking earlier on about the sort of the evolving nature of fraud and sort of sophistication. And I think a good example we got a prosecution for this about a year ago, maybe. So this is when I was in fraud operations in City of London Police. So we were looking at sort of national scale organised fraud and then sort of national to international money laundering. So very much that sort of organised financial crime that we were looking at. And the scammers, they set up an investment fraud company, and it was designed to look completely legitimate. So, had a nice office not so far from here in the city, glossy brochures, and, they gave the victims an online platform so they could track their investments, the candle charts and all those sorts of things. But they've got away with about £20 million in fraud. They weren't investing anything. Of course, it was just going into their pockets and getting moved around, which is kind of a relatively standard investment fraud approach. But I think where they took that sophistication to another level and that creativity and that willingness to re-exploit victims is that operating as a apparently legitimate company, they were taking personal data from the victims, their sort of KYC, the scans of their passports, their bank records and national insurance numbers and whatever else you can think of, all looking like they were just doing due diligence and making sure that you're right for this investment. What they're then doing, they're taking all those personal details from the 600 victims, and they were using them to create companies, open bank accounts, open crypto accounts, and then they were basically using them to build a bespoke money laundering network that allowed them to take those funds from UK victims, move them internationally, and then place them into criminally safe jurisdictions. And And then when the fraud collapsed, it still had this money laundering network, and they're effectively working as consultant money launderers. Take a cut of the money from another OCG, move the money, and then place it where they wanted. You want Rolexes in France, we can do that. You want crypto in the US, we can do that. And that's what they're doing. So that sort of further exploitation and reaping multiple harvests from their sort of criminal enterprise, I think, is that marker of a more modern, more sophisticated approach to financial crime. And it's not just investment fraud. We see it in all sorts. Romance fraud is a terrible, terrible crime. They talk about the psychological damage from romance fraud as being akin to, sort of being a victim of a sexual offence. It's really damaging. But now what we're seeing is they're not satisfied just taking all their money, getting them to take out loans and all the credit they can from the banks and emptying their credit cards and taking loans out from their family. When they've exhausted all of this, they're then getting them to have money from other victims pass through their bank accounts. They're opening other bank accounts or, crypto accounts. So they've got other victims' money moving through their accounts.
To victim credit.
Absolutely, from victim to victim and moving on, or, purchasing phones and laptops and shipping them to, wherever. So they end up working in a way for the organised crime group, facilitating their business. And of course, as law enforcement, when we learn this is happening, we have to have that conversation with the victim. And that's devastating. Because not only have they been exploited and, we're telling them that they're not going to marry whoever they think they're going to marry, but they've also been facilitating crime against other romance fraud victims. That's really devastating.
And are they aware of that, or is it denial? Are they living in a state of denial generally?
Often there is denial. It really depends. It really does depend. We've done a lot of work over the years to try and be better at communicating these things, use the right language to, sort of provide support and avoid, victim blaming and all these sorts of things. But they're hugely difficult conversations, and it can take time. It can take time for a victim to come round to what's happened and then come to terms with the wider aspect of, being, having other victims' money move through their accounts is, another step of exploitation, which is, unfortunately, they're going to have to come to terms with.
Maybe a question from my side related to that. You get lots of cases where someone is victimized and then pulled into the syndicate or network to then further victimize other people. I mean, this happens in human trafficking. Often the trafficked people end up luring other trafficked people in money laundering cases where people unknowingly become money mules and then get threatened that if they tell anyone, they will be outed to the police. What is the sort of stance on that sort of victim-offender relationship? And what is the legal, as the police, what are your legal recourses to view someone as primarily a victim, even if they have actually knowingly committed a crime?
It's a really grey area, and it's the sort of thing that you need to approach case by case. I mean, fundamentally, one of our most principal aims is to look after victims, look after vulnerable people, protect the community. So that's absolutely fundamental. If people are a victim and they're committing a crime under duress, I mean, they're forced to, then that's obviously something that's clear, or not always clear, but that's a factor we can take into consideration. But also someone could be a victim of one crime and a perpetrator of another. And sometimes you just have to deal with them separately. They don't necessarily cancel each other out. But fundamentally, we try to look after people that need looking after. We try to protect those people that need protection. And if, an organised crime group is exploiting someone, then, we are interested in putting the main beneficiaries of that group in prison, the main decision makers of that group in prison, not necessarily the money mules, because, they're relatively low on the food chain. As much as they might have committed a crime, that's not our main purpose. So it really depends on what it is you're looking at the time. Sometimes it might be down to the jury. It's up to them to decide.
And just going back to your previous example, because so it's a big question. I just have to have very clear answer. But I mean, how do you start solving this level of sophistication in age of much organized crime that are setting up a legitimate business, companies house registered, taking out a lease? I mean, if you think operationally, all of the steps they're taking, but also all the kind of regulation and, let's call it, barriers and steps in place to do a bunch of things, and they're still able to get through it. I mean, taking out a lease as an example, opening a bank account, there's all of those things as a legitimate business is hard enough. So, right, so where to from here? I think is my question. I know it's a big one and it's going to be tough, but yeah,
it's a big question. I think in the UK we're doing a lot of the right things, but I think we need to be better at all of those things. So, more scrutiny from Companies House, better oversight by banks. And I'm not blaming banks in the slightest. It's just, we're dealing with huge volume. Law enforcement needs to be better at prioritising, where we're looking for our investigations, make sure we're focusing on the highest harm individuals and groups. But I think also pooling those resources, getting better at communicating is really important as well. I mean, one of the quickest routes that we have to identify wrongdoing, financial crime, are SARS. And I know there's a huge, people think that SARS reports just go into a black hole and then never get seen again. And
just for any of the listeners, a SAR is a suspicious activity report.
Yes.
Which is when a financial institution notices something weird or suspicious, and then reports it up to the regulator.
Exactly. So it could be an STR, an SIR, it could be, the names differ in different jurisdictions.
And the regulator passes that on to law enforcement.
So in different jurisdictions, the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, sits in different organisations. So in the UK, it's the NCA, which is law enforcement, as opposed to the regulator. But it differs. So, an agency will have ownership, and they'll then pass that out to, different organisations, police, regulators, and that's a database of intelligence we can continuously dip into. So even if we get a SAR or an STR, we don't act on it straight away, that data's still there. We can still use it. And it might be that piece in that puzzle that we need 6 months later, and we suddenly understand with that little piece how a money laundering network works. So extremely valuable. But what's especially valuable about it is that with those reports, the crime's still taking place and we can take action quickly. So if the money's still flowing, we can freeze it. If the scam company's still running, we can do warrants. We can arrest people. We can get laptops and phones and get great evidence. Sometimes a victim might not know they're a victim of saved investment fraud for a number of years, in which case the suspects are gone, the money's been moved, the laptops have all been destroyed, so we're on the back foot. So that kind of rapid identification of suspicion, reporting. Well, exactly what is happening. Absolutely. And sharing that information across all agencies and organisations, law enforcement, regulators, banks, I think everyone pooling that information and, looking for these suspicions. I think that's where we can sort of pull all the little improvements we're all making all together, and then in as one sort of pool, if you like, have a kind of an overall improvement that can make us a little bit more effective and a bit more efficient at tackling financial crime.
I mean, is there a breakdown there? Is there a breakdown when you pass on a piece of communication or information from one institutional person to another? I mean, as kids used to pay broken telephone, right? Like, it gets a little bit diluted. So are you saying it just needs to be tighter sharing of that information in a more centralized view?
Yeah, I think, particularly from law enforcement regulators, you're always going to have red tape. You're always going to have legal gateways to getting access to information, which is right, but it slows things down.
So there's a balance there.
There's a balance. In the ideal world, we'd have regulators and law enforcement have instant access to data, even if it's gatewayed by, a judge's authority.
Just because we're wrapping up, in an ideal world where you had all the things you see on TV that cops apparently have but don't really exist, what is the one imaginary crime fighting tool that you would actually want?
It's probably not necessarily financial crime, but the thing that you always see on these programs is CCTV that they can miraculously manipulate.
Zoom, hands.
Exactly. And I've even had people kind of go, "Oh, can't you manipulate the CCTV and get the suspect's face?" No, if it's bad CCTV from above and they're wearing a baseball cap, that's it. That's all you're going to get. But, if we had some miraculous technology where you could turn it around and enhance it and get an identification for the person doing a scam in a bank straight away, that'd be amazing.
I mean, not too far off. Let's use that analogy of CCTV and wrap it up on your data, right? If you could manipulate the data, spin it around, look into it, it's effectively the same.
Yeah.
Thing, right?
Oh, it'd be game changing. Yeah. I mean, if we had, if you had your SAR and then just on the back of the SAR, you instantly had all of the data that led to that suspicion just there, ready to go, without having to go back and forth with court orders and back and forth to the bank and, realizing that the data's corrupt or you forgot to ask for a bank account, and which takes a significant amount of time. If it's all just there and you could just click along the chain of evidence, it'd be brilliant. It'd be amazing. Yeah.
On that note, Gareth, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Good.